Is DLC worth it?
Last year, I finally played Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, the two expansions for The Witcher 3, and not only did I enjoy them, but I actually liked them way more than the base game. Gantaro Dim is the most compelling antagonist in the series, and maybe just in video games in general. Toussaint is a wildly well-designed region that manages to feel massive while still being easy to navigate, unlike most other areas in the game, and the quests are more ambitious, thought-provoking, and fun than anything Wild Hunt has to offer, which is saying
I still have to play Wild Hunt, like Witcher 3 or whatever. Like, like I saw the show or whatever, and I thought the show was pretty good. And like watching Henry Cavill like do his thing as like a Witcher fan was also pretty cool. But it just wanted me, it just I wanted to play the game more. Um, After I saw the show, I need to still.
something, as the base game has plenty of great quests. Really, everything about them, from the characters to the writing to the animations to the boss fights to the music, seems to be turned up a notch, and it really feels like CD Projekt Red was firing on all cylinders when working on these DLCs. And I almost skipped them. Frankly, if it weren't for friends regularly telling me how good they were, I would have, because I didn't love the base game all that much, and after spending 60 plus hours playing it, the idea of playing more sounded exhausting. And that would have sucked, because Hearts of Stone and especially Blood and Wine are two of my favorite things I've played in the past few years, but due to them being packaged with a game I didn't vibe as much with, they felt skippable. And this has got me thinking a lot about DLC and the role it plays in the gaming landscape. In general, there seems to be a common sentiment that downloadable content is disposable, and that makes a lot of sense.
I think that's gonna depend on game to game or whatever, whether or not DLC is disposable or whatever. I've had plenty of games where I look at the DLC and you can tell like whether or not it's disposable or whatever. Like I would say, I think for fighting games, like right here or whatever, like, what is this? I don't know what game this is. But like, if there's like a fighting game and they're just like trying to sell you like a new character or something, yeah, I think that's a fine addition or whatever. But like there's a lot of good DLCs. I can't like if I sense that a game has like shitty DLCs, I just won't buy it and really expose myself to like to it or whatever. But like Skyrim, goated ass DLCs. Dragon Age, I think Dragon Age 1 and 3 were pretty good with like the DLC or whatever. What else? There's a ton of other games that have awesome DLC.
While some pieces of DLC provide a hefty amount of content that gives players a fresh and fulfilling experience, others aren't nearly as robust, typically coming in the form of individual missions, maps, characters, weapons, or cosmetics. All of these things can breathe some new life into a game and be exceptionally well made, but as they are smaller chunks of content, they seldom have a massive impact. Also, some DLCs that fall into this camp are just another form of microtransactions and turn predatory far too often, which is stupid and bad. I think treating this
it's stupid and bad. True, man.
Kind of downloadable content as expendable is largely a good thing, because with a few exceptions, it rarely provides enough new stuff to feel worthwhile. With that said, even expansion content can feel expendable. They may provide some more time with the title, but they aren't a necessary part of it. Expansions, by nature, are designed to expand on the original game. If they were truly integral to the experience, every game with expansion DLC would have to come out unfinished, which I guess isn't that much of a stretch when it comes to many AAA games.
It's like expansion DLC is in general, I would think worth it. It's gonna depend on game to game or whatever, but you know, like Monster Hunter, like what was it between Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Iceborne? I think it was. I think that was a great expansion. Monster Hunter, what was it, Rise to Sunbreak? That was another good expansion or whatever for a game. And you could argue like it's an entire like new game for each World of Warcraft thing. Like the new expansion comes out, adding onto the base game, but you know, it's here or there. But yeah, it's like DLC. Like if you really like a game, DLC can prolong the lifespan and the playability of your whatever your favorite game is or whatever.
but it certainly isn't a business model to aim for. Due to it being supplemental, only a small portion of players of the base game will engage with it, and that feels like a waste, because in my experience, expansion type DLC is almost always of a higher quality than the content of the base game.
Yeah.
This doesn't necessarily mean that it's better than the base game, as DLC is meant to serve a different function.
Or let's take Borderlands, for example. There's so much DLC, or like in those games or whatever. Yeah, a great example.
Typically is smaller in scope and often integrated into the game itself, so it's hard to compare the two outright. One is a full experience and the other isn't, although some get pretty close. However, for many studios, what they produce is a cut above whatever came before. The quality jump I noticed with Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine in comparison to the base game is not unique to The Witcher 3. For instance, if you ask a die-hard Soulsborne fan what their favorite boss fight is in the series, there is a very good chance they will hit you with one that came from DLC. It's a common occurrence across the industry, from Minerva's Den perfectly melding the approach to world building and storytelling of Bioshock 1 with the gameplay of Bioshock 2, to Left Behind masterfully utilizing slow moments in order to develop its core relationship while also elevating enemy encounters to a new level of technical complexity. DLCs give studios a chance to experiment with and build on the ideas and lessons learned during development of the original game. Due to my growing admiration of expansion content, I wanted to learn more about the process of developing DLC in the hopes of learning why it is typically my favorite content in a game. So I reached out to a few developers that have experience making some, those being Nick Wozniak, a pixel artist for Shovel Knight, Plague of Shadows, Spectre of Torment, King of Cards, and Shovel Knight Showdown, Laxon, the creative director of Crosscode and A New Home, and Alex Beecham, the creative director of Outer Wilds and Echoes of the Eye. While their respective studios, Yacht Club Games, Radical Fish, and Mobius Digital, all took vastly different approaches to creating DLC, their experiences still have a lot of similarities. I don't know if these commonalities are universal across the wider gaming landscape, but I'd imagine some are, as they just follow common sense. For instance, when looking at why expansions often end up being the best bits of content in a game, the answer is simply that the devs have a better understanding of how to make the game.
I think as you are developing your game, you're getting good at developing your game. So you're developing tools and understandings of the processes needed to make the game itself. But once a lot of those really low-level foundational ideas are done, you have a team that's like good at making those games. So like we can focus on the parts that are more interesting and unique and not just continually like do the basic stuff.
Without needing to focus on creating the systems that...
So like kind of what he's saying is like once the player has like developed like some skill set for that game, they're like in the bell curve of skill, whether it's like, oh, they're at least in the middle or something, or getting like really good. And then you can start introducing like new ideas and concepts with that given like foundational work
that make the game work. Developers can spend more time finding the most interesting ways to use those systems. This allows them to iterate on what works, put resources into polishing what they already have, and push the various systems to their limits. With more general experience, they also have a better understanding of what makes the game the game. Based on these interviews, as well as various accounts I've read about the production of DLC, most studios start working on it either late into development of the base game or after. So by that point, a game's identity should be firmly established, making it easier for the devs to determine what additions will and won't make sense. On top of that, as owning the base game is often a prerequisite for DLC, that means the developers have a built-in audience they can design around. While expansions may be developed with the hope that it will draw new folks in, the primary goal from a business perspective is to engage their already established player base, which means that DLC can be more specific in its construction. Doesn't have to worry so much about appealing to the most amount of people possible, as the audience is already largely defined. So instead of having to spend time teaching players basic concepts, they can start with more advanced mechanics, opening up the potential for what the expansion can be.
Depending on how far after the DLC is like released after the base game or whatever. So let's take like Doom Eternal as an example, which I'm like messing around with right now. Like, so I first played like Doom Eternal a bunch of times or whatever, and like it wasn't until like a couple months later that they came out with like, I forgot what the heck it was called. There's like a little DLC part 1 and part 2. Now it's easy to like get your skill back. It's not easy, but it's like it's kind of tough for like a specific skill set that's Doom, and if you just like go back in on like the same difficulty, that game will just kick your ass or whatever. But yeah, I get pretty much what he's saying. You know, you got your player base, they have their skill set, and you know, that's your base of players that you're designing for. They know what's coming, more or less, just in a new way.
That was one idea why we wanted to make like a really long dungeon for the DLC that really tries to make the most out of all the mechanics we already had up to this point. In general, we have this design approach to puzzles where we try to come up with simple mechanics and combine them to form new and interesting puzzles. And that's why we decided to develop a mechanic that really tries to unify everything.
When it comes to most DLCs, players are immediately thrown into content that tests their skills and requires them to think on a higher level. And gameplay like this generally ends up feeling the most satisfying and rewarding. Expansions don't need to tutorialize things in the same way as the base game because those lessons have already been established. So with DLC that doesn't require replaying parts of the game, players don't have to experience the potential tedium that can come from being taught basic things that they already understand. All of these aspects give developers the means to craft unique and complex content catered to the people who will actually play it. Of course, pulling this off is easier said than done, and just because development time doesn't need to be spent on building out tools doesn't mean it won't amount to a ton of work.
If you want to make a DLC that comes after the main game and is supposed to be better in some ways, it probably will take you longer to actually develop all that content, even if you have everything prepared, you have all the technology ready, you have your process, you have your pipelines and everything. It will still take longer because you have to do it better. You have to think about ways how to improve it, how to make it even more interesting.
Right. Because there's already some base level of expectation that you've already built up with the audience. You know, when they go to buy a DLC, they're gonna be like, oh, okay, it's gonna be it's gonna be like eating vanilla ice cream and then vanilla ice cream and sprinkles and cherry on top and like whipped cream and all that other shit. Essentially is like what he's getting at.
Something better involves constant iteration and experimentation, which takes a considerable amount of effort. When developers have more time on their hands, they want to use it to its fullest potential, meaning they do what they can to improve whatever it is they're working on, whether it be art, design, music, or gameplay. And this kind of focus is what leads to highly polished DLC that feels a step above its base game. But honing in on minute details is far from simple work. On top of this, when there is an established audience, there are also expectations that have to be managed. So developers have to find the perfect balance of providing their players with what they already enjoyed while also offering something new.
So for those reasons, like I would go so far as to say, like, wait until a game at least has like its first DLC drop, maybe before you even like buy the game or whatever. I know that's like kind of ridiculous to say, but like if I've never played I've never played any of the Witcher games, but I know when I do go to play them, I'm just gonna like chunk through each little part. I'll play like the first game, all the DLC, second game, all the DLC, third game, all the DLC, and that skill set, it won't have diminished if I got the game like on day one, and then I'm like, okay, the game's beaten, I'll go play something else, and then a couple months later, oh, we got the DLC, freaking awesome, you know, I'm super excited, and then you have to develop your skills all over again. Yeah, so that is a thing.
If they lean too much into the familiar, players might not think it's a worthwhile expansion, and if it's too different, they might not be interested in the new direction. Along with this, there is also the challenge of figuring out the best way to incorporate the DLC, like should it be fully standalone or integrated into the base game, and if it's integrated, where should it be placed? This decision can have a huge impact on whether or not players will actually come back to play it, and the answer is different for every game, making it difficult to know the best path.
So at least for like Borderlands 2, which I am a fan of, there would be like end game DLC, there'd be like side quest DLC, and it would be like just awesome. Like you could do like the main story or whatever, and then just once you reach like a point, you can just veer off, go do the DLC, get some guns or whatever, and then come back and like just continue on the main story. And that's really fun. If like a developer makes like some sort of like side quest type deal that you can do during the game as opposed to like end game stuff. But there's like a huge amount of value in that.
Furthermore, it's hard to keep a player base engaged without a steady flow of new content. When it comes to single-player titles, a lot of folks beat it and then move on to the next one, and the more time that passes between them finishing the base game and the DLC being released, the less likely it is they will engage with it when it comes out. Most DLC can't afford to have long development times. While the need for a quicker turnaround is somewhat balanced out by expansions being smaller in scope, it still requires a wild amount of high-effort work that can be difficult to complete in a short amount of time. The reality is, games have a window of relevancy that they greatly benefit from releasing DLC within, or else risk losing sales. And that time frame is different for every title and has no concern for proper development cycles. Also, even though expansions most likely will have a higher sales floor than a brand new game as it is being directed at an established player base, it also has a way lower ceiling because it most likely won't reach far beyond that audience. Obviously, there are exceptions to this. For instance, Stardew Valley has had regular free content updates since its release, which has added a ton to the game's value and helped keep it in the public eye for a longer period of time. This has paid off massively as it has sold more copies in the past 3 years than it did during its first 4. The long-tail success Stardew Valley has had is certainly an outlier, and it's hard to compare its approach to DLC to most other games due to the drip feed nature of it. But releasing DLC, whether it be free or paid, does give developers and publishers the opportunity to both add value to their game as well as promote it more, and this can lead to new players. With that said, operating under the assumption that a massive amount of new folks will come in because of an expansion is a surefire way to lose money, so studios can really only rely on returning players when planning. In turn, this leads to developers having to work with tighter budgets, and these limitations can lead to studios having to shift the way they typically approach things.
We were like running from a boulder the whole time because we didn't have a full pre-production phase the way you would with like just a brand new project. So it was like kind of like, you know, the train's coming, we're just like laying the track as fast as humanly possible. And that happened in the base game too. Again, that's just making creative projects in general. But I think it's fair to say it happened a little more with the DLC just because we were moving at such a rapid pace.
The amount of strain that a studio developing DLC will undergo obviously differs from case to case. But due to its nature, it has the potential to create unique stressors and also exacerbate issues that are common in game development in general. One example of the latter can be seen with scope creep, which is a normal occurrence when developing a game and really just when doing any creative endeavor, but it seems to be more prevalent with expansion content. Both Yacht Club and Mobius Digital.
So I think what he's gonna like start getting at with scope creep is like, let's say you have like a base game and you know you beat it once and then your perception of that game's world is like a circle. All right. And then when an expansion or some DLC comes out, that circle gets bigger. And then another DLC comes out and then it gets bigger. Another one comes out and it gets bigger. So I think that's what he means by scope creep. And there's always this expectation to go bigger and badder, bigger, badder, betterest, fasterest, you know?
Experienced this while working on their DLCs. Originally, due to a stretch goal Yacht Club reached on their Kickstarter, Plague Knight, Spectre Knight, and King Knight were going to just be alternate characters you could play as within the original Shovel Knight campaign. But as the team began developing the DLCs, this shifted into each character essentially having their own game, which was a massive undertaking. These expansions all are around the same size as the base game, and in a lot of ways, each is better than the last. And I haven't even mentioned that they also made a multiplayer brawler where pretty much every single character you'd ever want to play as is playable. For Outer Wilds, Echoes of the Eye was originally pitched as a far shorter expansion, with a predicted runtime of 2 to 3 hours, but due to Mobius Digital following the ideas they were most passionate about, it ended up being way bigger. It's hard to estimate how long Outer Wilds and Echoes of the Eye take to beat, as so much depends on the player, but looking at the only website that truly matters, howlongtobeat.com, it puts the base game at around 16.5 hours and Echoes of the Eye at around 10.5.
Oh.
In the end,
I didn't even know that was a website. howlongtobeat.com. All right.
I'm like, oh, was Echoes of the Eye? Because we pretty much made a sequel and stuck it inside an existing video game, which just on the face of it is a terrible idea business-wise. But I think it's done pretty well.
As a consumer, this all is great. We get sizable chunks of content that could probably be packaged as their own game for a fraction of the price. And sometimes developers even offer them for free. Like for those who owned Shovel Knight while the expansions were being released, they just got them automatically, making it arguably the most valuable $15 a person could have spent on a game. The only competition I can think of is Stardew Valley and Hollow Knight, two other titles that offer a considerable amount of expansion content. And even now that the Shovel Knight collection has gone up in price, it still feels like a great deal because it contains 5 high-quality games. Most modern expansions, especially those for indie games, are just great deals. As a developer though, it's a bit more complicated. Spending a substantial amount of time developing DLC, especially DLC that goes far beyond the team's original plans, isn't inherently bad. Regardless of how long it takes to make, if it holds a ton of playtime and value, there's a better chance that fans will have it on their radar, which hopefully converts to more sales. Additionally, creating extra content that feels worthwhile builds good faith between developers and their audience. Most importantly though, it can make the game the best experience possible.
Newsflash. If you make good DLC for your game, more people are going to want to buy the base game. All right?
Which I think is what matters most to developers. Naturally, they want to make a living, but with everyone I talked to, creating a game they were proud of was clearly the priority. However, it is still a business, and when DLC expands beyond its original scope, it costs a lot of money with no guarantee of a return. Attach rates from returning players can vary drastically, and not only does this have sales implications, but it also just means there are fewer people playing it. And this can be hard to swallow when so much work and effort goes into making it. As I said before, a lot of studios who develop DLC begin it before the base game has shipped, meaning aside from data they may have from pre-orders or wish lists, they don't know how it will be received and if anyone would even be interested in an expansion. And all this can lead to the question, is it worth it to make DLC?
That's what we're thinking about all the time. We make DLC is like, who's going to play this? You know, everybody has a certain amount of games they can make in their whole life. Are we going to spend one of those games making DLC for something that 10% of people will play, if we're lucky.
The best choice for any studio in regards to if they should pursue DLC will depend on their long-term goals and what opportunities are presented to them. Obviously, developing expansions for games can be profitable creatively, experientially, and financially, otherwise no AAA game would ever do it. But the potential downsides that can come from creating DLC make it hard to know whether or not it is worthwhile. The problem is, developers can't really know what it is like to make DLC for their game until they actually make it. In general, game development is filled with a ton of risks, and the choice of whether or not it is worth it to pursue DLC is a notable one. Sometimes,
I mean, yeah, there's a big risk, but there's also a lot of reward to it too. And I think for the most part, at least for me, like the games that I remember playing that had like good DLC, they were like 100% worth it. Like I'd be hard like struck to like try to remember a game that had bad DLC.
when I see the amount of effort that has gone into an expansion, I can't help but wonder why they would release it as DLC and not just as a full game. Looking back at Blood and Wine, it is around the same size as many other open world RPGs that sell for full price, and in my opinion, it maintains a higher level of quality throughout its runtime than the vast majority of them. If CD Projekt Red had combined it and Hearts of Stone to be one cohesive $60 package, it would be more than a worthwhile purchase when comparing it to its competition. The problem with that logic, though, is that people wouldn't be comparing it to the competition. They'd be comparing it to The Witcher 3, a game that, despite my many gripes, has a ridiculous amount of content that, at the very least, typically manages to be good enough. There are expectations fans have for what the next Witcher game should be, and that certainly is not a game that could be beaten in quote-unquote just 25 hours. Throughout the past year, the discourse of certain sequels being glorified DLC has popped up a few times, most notably with God of War Ragnarok and The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. Both titles are direct sequels that act as a continuation of what came before instead of a reinvention of the established formula. But when the only things people knew about the games came from trailers, some felt that they looked too similar to their predecessors. In every instance I've seen of people calling them glorified DLC, the intent has been to diminish them for reusing elements of their previous game and seemingly call their scopes into question. Of course, once both titles...
So what are these people saying, that the sequel of the game, or you know, whatever they're talking about, is like the scope isn't big enough? so they're like dissatisfied with it, is what I'm guessing. I thought like the next Zelda game and the next God of War, I thought those were like, were like received pretty well. No, this was like coming out of left field for me.
Titles came out and people experienced the massive amount of content they had to offer, the majority of these criticisms stopped. Now, while the intent of these comments are off base, I do think there is some fairness in comparing both games to DLC, at least in terms of how they were developed. Both used the base of a prior title as a jumping off point instead of starting from scratch, and because of that, they were able to elevate their respective games to an unprecedented level. Obviously, plenty of sequels reuse things from their predecessor, but Ragnarok and especially Tears of the Kingdom lean into that more than most modern games do, and I have to imagine that that gave both development teams the opportunity to focus less on building tools and more on perfecting them.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of why I love both games so much. They built on what came before in a way that I think a lot of sequels are afraid to do. With all that said, people who compare sequels to DLC most certainly aren't looking at it.
Who is comparing a sequel to DLC? I never even knew that was a thing. I mean, yeah, I knew it's like the difference between like Borderlands 1, Borderlands 2, Borderlands 3, or whatever. Or, like, what else? What other games? Like, I don't know, Dead Space 1, Dead Space 2, Dead Space 3. I mean, I don't think I've ever compared a sequel to DLC. Because, I don't know, that just sounds like ridiculous.
In this way, and regardless of Ragnarok or Tears of the Kingdom being seen as good sequels, I don't think this sort of discourse will stop coming up, because it stems from A, people hating for the sake of hating, and B, players being worried about getting the most value from the games they purchase. And managing player expectations is something every developer has to try to deal with. If CD Projekt Red had wanted to turn Blood and Wine into what many of their fans would consider a full game, they probably would have had to triple its length. And I actually think that would have made me like it way less, because its smaller scope was a big reason I was able to get invested in the world. For developers to make an expansion feel like a proper full follow-up to their previous game, they would have to add a ton to it, fundamentally changing the experience. It would also mean way more development time, which depending on the sorts of things the studio's interested in making in the future may not be something they want to commit to, as they'd like to move on to a new project. And this actually leads to another reason some studios decide to pursue expansion content, simply to have something to work on as they figure out what is the next big thing. For both Crosscode and Outer Wilds, their DLCs acted as a sort of connecting project between full releases. Neither Radical Fish or Mobius Digital were ready to pitch their next title, so developing these expansions gave them some more time to figure out what would be next, while also keeping everyone at the studio working and getting paychecks. Now, this doesn't always go as intended, because as I pointed out already, developing DLC is hard. It takes a lot of time and focus, which can make it difficult to juggle other projects, leading to studios not getting as much of a head start on a new game as they hoped they might. Regardless, it does still create shorter term work that can help studios continue to chug along. Honestly, the main thing I've learned from all of the conversations I had is that it's a miracle any game ever gets made. And obviously that applies to expansions as well. There are countless obstacles developers have to overcome to make either, and frankly, I've barely even scratched the surface of what those are. So many decisions are made on a daily basis that players never think about, despite them having a massive role in shaping the games we love. When it comes to expansions, I think the limitations placed on developers leads to some of the most creative ideas and solutions to problems. Working within a smaller scope allows them to hone in on and polish the best bits to make something special, something that is designed with actual players and fans in mind instead of prospective ones. DLCs allow studios to make games that wouldn't make sense to make in any other context. And as it turns out, those are the ones I'm most interested in playing. This video obviously was mostly focused on the process of how expansions are made instead of my thoughts on specific pieces of DLC. But as it turns out, I have a lot to say about a bunch of expansions, so I actually created a companion video to this one where I made a tier list of a handful of DLCs I've played. And you can watch it right now over on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service owned by creators, myself being one of them. And over there you can watch everything I post on YouTube ad-free, as well as a bunch of videos that are exclusive to Nebula. Pretty much anything anytime I have a new video here, I post a bonus one over there. These range from typical video essays to interviews to now me losing my mind a bit as I try to arbitrarily rank things. Next we have Echoes of the Eye, which let me just move all this over. Am I too nice? Am I giving out too many S's? Echoes of the Eye definitely deserves the S, but not. I got 5 S's. Am I a softie? Should I be meaner to games? It is also one of the best ways to support me as a creator, because when you sign up for Nebula using my link in the description, I get a chunk of that money for as long as you're subscribed. And if you sign up using my link, it comes out to just a bit over $2 a month. And you not only get access to the exclusive stuff I make, but also to everything else on the website. That includes Nebula originals, like Lindsay Ellis's recent piece on Guy Fieri, classes from various creators, like Patrick Willem's series on analyzing films, and just other pieces of exclusive content, like bonus episodes of Jacob Geller's podcast, Something Rotten. It is an absolutely stacked service that will give you loads of extra stuff to watch and listen to, while also directly supporting me. So check it out and listen to me ramble in an unscripted fashion about my thoughts on some expansions I've played. Anyway, thanks to Nebula for sponsoring this video. For everyone still here,
Nice.
yo. I'd like to thank my patrons for making this channel possible and give a special shout out to William Glenn 8 and Victor Duva for being honorary beg
Okay,
beauties.
I mean, yeah, this video was awesome, and it goes into like trying to figure out how DLC is made. I mean, I had no idea it was like made alongside of the base game or whatever. So that was pretty cool. I mean, like back in the day, whenever I would play like older games or whatever, and then I would play like a DLC, my initial thought process was like, oh, they made the game and then they just started making the DLC and like, oh, that came out quick. And then they just dropped the DLC or whatever. And that's how my head worked or whatever. But like, that's crazy if it's made alongside of the main game and it's like a huge gamble and it's just as stressful. So, yeah. But, you know, overall, I think it was a great video. I liked it. Showed me a bunch of things that I had no idea about. And yeah, I want to see some more. So do that. And yeah, pretty much all I gotta say. Peace.